Abyssal Descent is about a bride whose life falls apart and becomes very sad after her cheating is revealed on her wedding day. Ilara Winthrop stood in the luminous embrace of the grand cathedral, her wedding gown cascading like a waterfall of silken dreams. The stained glass windows cast a kaleidoscope of colors across the aisle, mirroring the spectrum of emotions playing across her face. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, the day she would unite forever with Orion Maddox, her childhood sweetheart turned soon-to-be husband. Orion, tall and striking, stood at the altar, his gaze locked onto Ilara as she approached. Their guests, an assembly of family and friends, looked on with beaming smiles, unaware of the tempest brewing beneath the surface. As Ilara walked down the aisle, her father's arm a reassuring presence, she tried to quell the rising tide of anxiety within her. She had harbored a secret, one that threatened to shatter the idyllic scene before her. Reaching the altar, Ilara took her place beside Orion. He looked at her, his eyes a mix of love and something unreadable. The priest began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the sacred space. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a loud drum in the silence of her conscience. Then, the moment came. The words that should have sealed their union. "Do you, Orion Maddox, take Ilara Winthrop to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Orion's voice, usually so calm and assured, faltered. There was a pause, heavy and suffocating, before he spoke, his words slicing through the air like a cold blade. "I cannot." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Ilara's heart stopped. Time seemed to fracture, splintering into shards of disbelief. Orion turned to face the crowd, his voice steady but laced with a pain that cut deeper than anger. "I cannot marry a woman who has betrayed my trust, who has shattered the very foundation of our relationship." The world spun around Ilara. Whispers swelled like a rising tide, eyes boring into her with shock and judgment. Her secret, her grave mistake, was no longer hers alone. Orion had discovered her infidelity, and in the most public and devastating way, he had exposed it. Ilara's father stepped back, his expression a complex tapestry of confusion and disappointment. She wanted to speak, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but words failed her. She stood there, a statue of despair, as Orion continued. "I loved you, Ilara, more than words could ever express. But love is built on trust, and you have broken that trust irrevocably." He turned then, walking away from the altar, away from her, his steps echoing like a death knell. Ilara watched him go, her vision blurred by tears, her dream wedding crumbling into a nightmare. The guests began to murmur and rise, a chaotic symphony of movement and sound. Ilara felt hands guiding her, leading her away, but it was all distant, unreal. Her heart was shattered, her world eclipsed by the shadow of her own making. As she was ushered out of the cathedral, the last thing Ilara saw was the stained glass window, its colors now a mocking reminder of the joy that was supposed to be hers. In that moment, she realized the full weight of her actions and the irrevocable change they had wrought on her life. The door closed behind her, sealing her fate. The bride left alone, her vows unspoken, her heart eclipsed by a lie. The days following the disastrous wedding were a blur for Ilara Winthrop. The once vibrant and social butterfly had cocooned herself away in her small apartment, the curtains perpetually drawn, blocking out the probing eyes of the world. Each morning brought with it a fresh wave of shame and regret, and each night was a long, lonely stretch of introspection and tears. The social media frenzy was merciless. Ilara's phone, once a portal to friends and a calendar full of engagements, now felt like a device designed solely to deliver her daily dose of humiliation. Pictures of the abandoned altar, speculative posts, and harsh judgments filled her feeds. She wanted to reach out, to explain her side of the story, but the words never came. Instead, she remained silent, her reputation tarnished by a scandal of her own making. Her friends, or those she once considered friends, distanced themselves. Invitations ceased, and her calls went unanswered. Her parents, though supportive, had a hard time hiding their disappointment. The Winthrops were a well-respected family, and Alara's actions had cast a long, dark shadow over their name. Conversations with her parents became strained, filled with unspoken reproaches and sighs of what could have been. Work offered no respite either. Alara was a talented graphic designer, but her presence in the office became a source of awkwardness. Colleagues who used to greet her with smiles now offered only fleeting glances or hushed whispers as she passed. Her boss, Mr. Jenkins, had called her into his office, his expression a mix of concern and disapproval. "Alara, I understand you're going through a difficult time," he had said, "but you need to keep your personal issues outside of work. The team needs to focus, and right now, your situation is a distraction." Alara nodded, her throat tight, unable to articulate the turmoil inside her. She returned to her desk, her work now a mechanical process, void of the creativity and passion she once poured into it. The solitude was suffocating. The apartment that she and Orion had shared, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, now echoed with the ghosts of what could have been. The engagement photos still hung on the walls, a cruel reminder of her lost love and the happiness she had sabotaged. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the apartment amplified the noise in her head, the guilt, the self-loathing, the endless loop of what-ifs. She replayed that day at the altar over and over, each time hoping for a different ending, but the outcome was always the same. Alara had cheated on Orion with a fleeting, thoughtless fling. It was a mistake, a lapse in judgment during a moment of vulnerability. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized that one moment was all it took to unravel the tapestry of trust and love they had woven together. The shadow of disgrace followed her everywhere, a constant, unrelenting reminder of her betrayal. Alara Winthrop, once the life of every party, now found herself shunned, alone, and drowning in the consequences of her actions. The world outside continued its relentless pace, but for Alara Winthrop, time seemed to have stalled in the wake of her disgrace. The once cheerful and bustling apartment now felt like a mausoleum of her former life. The walls, adorned with memories of happier times, seemed to mock her with their permanence. Alara found herself spending hours just staring at them, lost in a sea of regret. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock of the scandal began to fade, replaced by a deeper, more pervasive sense of loss. Alara's thoughts often drifted to Orion, the love they had shared, and the future they had planned. The realization that she was the architect of her own ruin only intensified her despair. Her once meticulous grooming and dressing habits had given way to neglect. The mirror reflected a stranger, a woman with hollow eyes and unkempt hair, a stark contrast to the vibrant Alara she once knew. She began to avoid her own reflection, finding it too painful a reminder of what she had become. The few times she ventured outside were under the cloak of darkness. The city, which once felt like an open playground, now seemed like an obstacle course of judgment and pity. The familiar streets whispered her name, each step a reminder of her fall from grace. Alara's professional life, once a source of pride, had lost its sheen. Her work, once filled with creativity and passion, had become a monotonous chore. She could feel Mr. Jenkins' patience wearing thin as her performance continued to decline. The once supportive glances from him had now turned into looks of frustration and disappointment. One evening, as she sat listlessly at her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Hesitantly, she opened it and her heart skipped a beat. It was from Orion. Just a few words, but they cut through her like a knife. "I hope you find what you're looking for. Goodbye, Alara." That message was the final blow, the last link to her past life severed. She felt a sense of finality, a realization that there was no going back, no redemption. The weight of her actions, the enormity of her betrayal, finally settled in her heart, heavy and unmovable. Sleep became her only escape, though it was often restless and haunted by dreams of what could have been. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, her body drenched in sweat, as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her once again. The apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. The silence was oppressive, the loneliness a constant companion. Elara found herself talking to the walls, to the photos, to Orion's abandoned belongings, seeking some semblance of connection, however imaginary. One night, in a fit of rage and despair, she hurled a vase against the wall. It shattered, scattering pieces of glass across the floor, a physical manifestation of her shattered life. She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face, as she picked up the pieces. Each shard was a reflection of her mistakes, her regrets, her broken dreams. Elara Winthrop, once the epitome of joy and vivacity, now found herself in a world of broken glass, each piece a reminder of the life she had destroyed. The path ahead was unclear, the wounds deep, and the journey to redemption uncertain. The relentless march of time continued unabated, yet for Elara Winthrop, each day was a stagnant echo of the last. The once vibrant hues of her life had faded to the monochrome of solitude. Her apartment, a labyrinth of memories, resonated with the whispers of a life that once was full of love, laughter, and dreams, now replaced by an oppressive silence. As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock of her fall from grace was supplanted by a numbing acceptance. The scandal that had once set social media ablaze had simmered down, but the embers of her disgrace continued to smolder in hushed conversations and sideways glances. Elara had become a ghost in her own life, haunting the fringes of the world she once inhabited. Her once close-knit circle of friends had dissipated, leaving her in a void of isolation. Attempts to reach out were met with polite excuses or, more often, a deafening silence. She understood their reticence. Association with her was a blemish they were unwilling to bear. The vibrant social life she had once taken for granted had vanished, leaving her to grapple with the unfamiliar territory of loneliness. Work had become her only escape from the four walls of her apartment, but even there, she was an island unto herself. The camaraderie and teamwork that had once defined her workplace now seemed like distant memories. Colleagues interacted with her out of necessity, their conversations devoid of warmth. The creative spark that had once defined her career had dimmed, her projects now a reflection of her internal turmoil, competent but lacking the vibrancy and innovation that had once been her hallmark. In the quiet of her apartment, Elara often found herself speaking aloud, if only to break the silence that enveloped her. She talked to the photographs on the wall, to Orion's belongings that she couldn't bring herself to part with, to the very walls that confined her. These one-sided conversations were a balm to her loneliness, yet they also served as a poignant reminder of what she had lost. Her parents, still reeling from the scandal, maintained a strained relationship with her. Their calls, once frequent and full of affection, had dwindled to obligatory check-ins. The disappointment in their voices was palpable, a constant reminder of the pain she had inflicted not just on herself, but on those she loved. Elara's relationship with her own reflection had grown increasingly turbulent. The mirror, once a testament to her confidence and vitality, now revealed a stranger, a woman marked by the ravages of regret and sorrow. Avoiding her own gaze, she would often dress in the dim light of dawn, unwilling to confront the reality of her own existence. Nights were the hardest. The darkness seemed to amplify her isolation, each tick of the clock a reminder of her stagnant existence. Sleep, when it came, was a restless affair, fraught with dreams of accusatory faces and voices echoing her own self-condemnation. In her solitude, Elara had taken to writing. Pages filled with confessions, apologies, and reflections, a tangible manifestation of her inner turmoil. Yet, These words were meant for no one's eyes but her own. They were a testament to her journey through the wilderness of remorse, a chronicle of a soul grappling with the consequences of its actions. Elara Winthrop, once the life and soul of every gathering, now found solace in the whispers of empty rooms, her voice the only counterpoint to the silence that had become her constant companion. The path to redemption seemed as elusive as ever, a distant light flickering in the vast darkness of her new reality. The relentless passage of time did little to heal the wounds of Elara Winthrop. The once effervescent and lively soul had been reduced to a mere shadow, drifting through the days in a haze of despondency and regret. Her apartment, once a haven of love and warmth, had become her solitary cell, its walls echoing the depths of her despair. Elara's life had contracted to the point where work was her only tether to the outside world. But even there, she was a ghost, her presence barely acknowledged, her contributions overlooked. Mr. Jenkins had once seen potential in her, but now his glances held only pity and resignation. Her work, once a source of pride and joy, had become a burdensome chore, each task a monumental effort in her state of listlessness. The world outside seemed to move on, indifferent to her plight. Friends who had once shared her joys and sorrows were now just distant memories, their laughter and chatter replaced by the oppressive silence of her apartment. Her phone, once a buzzing hub of activity, now lay dormant, a stark reminder of her isolation. In the depth of her solitude, Elara's thoughts often turned dark. The night brought no respite, only endless hours of introspection, each thought a spiral deeper into the abyss of her own making. The darkness seemed to close in on her, its weight crushing, its expanse endless. Her parents' attempts to reach out were met with monosyllabic responses or silence. They tried to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but Elara had built walls too high for their words of comfort to scale. The once cherished family bond was now strained, taut with the unspoken pain and disappointment.